First of all, I would like to thank Emory University and the Emeritus College for the awards that I recently received for the projects that will help us continue and process the material, as Gretchen mentioned. The order of my presentation is as follows. First, I will introduce you to the site, then tell you a little bit about the history of the project, then go to the historical background of the material that we are uncovering, and describe the nature of the evidence, try to talk a little bit about the goals of the project, and then outline the work that is still to be done that is in part going to be financed by these awards. So first of all, the site. The site is known today as Tell Halif. In Arabic, it's called Tell Halif, which means the mound of the little caliph, and Halif is in Hebrew caliph. You can see it marked here on the map with an X. It's at the edge of the hill country coming down from Jerusalem, which is here, and it's not very far from Beersheba. The Dead Sea is to the east, the Mediterranean is right here to the west, and all of these features are very important in the history of the site, as you will see. This is what the site looks like from the west. Right here, this is the mound, or as it is known in Semitic languages, a tell. A tell is a mound of ruins. Right here, at the foot of the mound, there are several water sources. The forest that you see here was planted recently in the last few decades. This is a view from the mound to the west. In the good old days when there was no air pollution, you could see the Mediterranean here, but now it's a little bit obstructed, but you can see that there was a clear view of the Mediterranean. It's very important because a major road from Egypt to Mesopotamia was going along the Mediterranean. It's known as the Via Maris, and a branch of it would go here. As you can see here, this is the modern road going up to Hebron in Jerusalem. A view to the east shows us the agricultural lands that probably were cultivated by the occupants of the Tell in the several historical periods. And right here in the back are the foothills of Mount Hebron. The project that I'm involved with started in 1976. We are now in phase 4. Phase 1, that was directed by Joe Sager from Mississippi State University, was mostly involved in recovering the history of the site, or as we call it, the stratigraphy, the order of strata, the order of levels. I'll mention it in a few minutes. Then phase 2, also directed by Sager, concentrated on recovery of remains from the early Bronze period. Phase 3, that was co-directed by myself and Paul Jacobs from Mississippi State University. We started working mostly on the Iron II. In a minute, I'll explain a little bit more about it. The Iron II, and then in phase 4 that I'm directing right now, we concentrated on the remains from the Iron II. This is a view of the site right here, and the different areas that were excavated are nicely marked. This is field 1, where we recovered most of the stratigraphy. Field 2 is on the Acropolis of the site, and We recovered mostly material from the Hellenistic Persian period and a little bit earlier. Field 3 here on the west, that's where we started recovering material from the Iron 2. Then we extended it to Field 4, Field 5. I'm going to talk mostly about Field 5 because this is the latest phase of our work. We also uncovered some remains from the Roman Byzantine period right here. There was a village. Earlier periods like the Chalcolithic, the 3rd millennium was occupying this area. We worked a little bit in the Roman cemetery, and then one volume that I published was on the Iron Age 2 cemetery that was right here across the valley from the Tell. This modern settlement is Kibbutz Lahav. I was a member of this kibbutz, and for me, every summer going to work at the site means that I'm going back home. This is just a quick review of the different levels that we uncovered. We uncovered over 20 strata, 20 levels that go all the way from the Chalcolithic period to the modern Arab time. And we are going to look in detail at just one part of this history that we call the Iron 2. Iron Age 2 is also subdivided to A, B, and C. And the site was destroyed in 701, and this is something that I'm going to discuss in detail. And so this is the period that we are interested in. Then it was followed by later periods that overlie the material from the Iron 2. But I'm going to concentrate mostly on this period that for us, it's labeled stratum B, that is dated from about 800 to 700 BCE. Now, the destruction that I showed on this chart is the result of a revolt against Assyria that was done in 701 BCE. The main characters of this event are Sennacherib, king of Assyria, who reigned between 705 and 681, and Hezekiah, king of Judah, who reigned between 715 and 686. The revolt was actually organized by Hezekiah. Hezekiah organized a coalition of countries who were vassals of Assyria. And what it meant as far as the revolt was concerned is that they stopped paying tribute. And being a vassal was very important to Assyria because that's how they made their money, with the tribute and everything they could take out of their vassals. So it was very important to Sennacherib to regain control over these countries, and he went on a campaign. I think that one reason that Hezekiah chose this time to revolt is that Sennacherib was new on the throne, and this was a good time to revolt. Hezekiah himself really prepared the kingdom of Judah very carefully for the revolt, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But Sennacherib did not wait too long, and in his third military campaign, he set out to regain control over the Levant. Now, we know about this particular event from some biblical sources, as 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah. Assyrian sources, which I will discuss in a minute, also tell us about this event. They are mentioned in Sennacherib's prisms, which I will show you in a minute, and some reliefs from Nineveh. And then in other sources like Herodotus and Josephus. And this event, this revolt, left its mark in archaeology. There are 3 prisms that are known as Sennacherib's prisms. One is in the British Museum, one is in the Chicago Oriental Institute, and one is in Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. And basically, they are copies of each other. They agree with each other about the details. What we know about the campaign is that Sennacherib went on his 3rd campaign to the land of Hatti, that's the Levant, and he mentions here the different countries that he conquered, and one by one, and how he managed to impose his control and then exert tribute and gifts for my lordships annually without interruption. He started from where Syria and Lebanon are located today and went down the coastal plain, took care of the Philistine cities, took care of the Phoenicians, and then turned around towards Jerusalem. And here is what we learn about it from the Bible. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, which falls in 701, King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. It's interesting that in the Bible, they say King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against, as if it was out of his own, volition. But it was, of course, in response to Hezekiah's revolt. Sennacherib's record tells us that as to Hezekiah the Judahite, who did not submit to my yoke, let me see, I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts, and to the countless small villages in their vicinity, and conquered them. We learn a little bit more about this particular event. As I said, Sennacherib, after capturing the coastal plain, went to Jerusalem. By the way, he went to Jerusalem by way of Tell Halif, which we will talk about it in a minute. But when he got to Jerusalem, he says that he put him like a caged bird shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. I threw up earthworks against him. And then as the result, as for Hezekiah, the terrifying splendor of my majesty overcame him, and the Arabs and his mercenary troops, which he had brought in to strengthen Jerusalem, his royal city, deserted him. However, Sennacherib he laid siege to Jerusalem, but he never captured Jerusalem. And he, according to the Bible, he had to leave because some miraculous event happened. An angel of the Lord appeared at night and killed so many of his soldiers, and he had to leave. But one thing that he managed to do is he managed to capture the city of Lachish, which was the second most important city of Judah. On the prism, Sennacherib does not mention being in Lachish and capturing Lachish. We know that he was there because of the fact that he sent emissaries from Lachish to Jerusalem to negotiate with Hezekiah, and probably part of the negotiation was that Hezekiah agreed to pay tribute and have Sennacherib leave him alone. However, in spite of the fact that Sennacherib does not mention his capture of Lachish or even being in Lachish on the prisms, he, in his palace in Nineveh, which is nowadays in Iraq, he dedicated his throne room to the capture of Lachish by placing these beautiful reliefs that you see here on the walls of the throne room. And this was a part of his psychological warfare, because if anyone comes to meet with the king in the throne room, would see something like this, obviously would get scared and wouldn't want to revolt. And what you see here, this is a very small part of the reliefs that were around the room, but you can see here one of the towers that defended Lachish. The defenders are standing right here, and they are fighting against the battering ram that was placed on this ramp that, by the way, archaeologists recovered. And what they are doing is they are throwing torches to burn down the battering ram, and the Assyrians are pouring water to keep it from catching fire. At the same time, we can see here people from Lachish are leaving the city, are going to exile. And an important part is right here, which I will show you a detail of it, because it shows how Sennacherib dealt with the leaders of the revolt. Obviously not with Hezekiah himself. Now, on this relief, we see Sennacherib sitting on his throne, and an inscription says, Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria, sat upon his throne and passed in review the booty from Lachish. And indeed, he really exacted quite a bit. As I mentioned, the leaders of the revolt were punished, and the Assyrians were very well known for torturing their enemies. So here is a description of what they did to the leaders. I assaulted Ekron, which was a Philistine city, part of the coalition, and slew its officials and nobles who had rebelled, and hung their bodies on poles around the city. The common citizens who rebelled and committed sinful acts, I counted as spoil. The rest of them who were not guilty of rebellion and contempt, I released. So can you imagine going to the throne room and seeing something like this? You're going to have second thoughts about revolting against Sennacherib. The tribute or the booty that he received is enumerated in both the prism and the Bible, and there is almost exact agreement between the two sources. On the prism, it says that Sennacherib received 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, gems, antimony, jewels, large carnelians, ivory-laid couches, ivory-laid chairs, elephant hides, elephant tusks, ebony, boxwood, all kinds of valuable treasures, as well as his daughters, his harem, his male and female musicians. Now, the Bible tells us that in addition to the 300 talents of silver, which is, the Bible is 300, Sennacherib says it's 800, but it adds that all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord, namely the temple in Jerusalem, and the treasures of the king's house, at that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorpost that the king Hezekiah of Judah had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. So he paid dearly for his revolt. In addition to it, Sennacherib tore off big parts of the land and gave it to Hezekiah's neighbors. So the kingdom of Judah really suffered tremendously and was left very, very small, much smaller than when it was at the beginning of the revolt. So now we get to the archaeological evidence. And what I'm going to present is the evidence from Tell Halif, from our site. It's important to remember that Lachish was excavated. There were maybe already 4 or 5 expeditions to Lachish. The first one was in the 30s. And one of the important things that came out of the work in Lachish is the identification of the stratum, the level that was destroyed by Sennacherib. And we refer to it as stratum 3. And the material from stratum 3 is the one that serves as the standard for identifying materials from other destructions in the land of Judah. So what you see here are remains of mostly storage jars, and they are known as the LMLK-type jars. I said before that Hezekiah prepared the kingdom for the revolt. He knew that when Sennacherib would come, there would be long sieges, so he had to supply commodities to all the cities, all the places that Sennacherib might attack. So he came up with this type of jar, storage jar, that contained different kind of commodities like oil, wine, grain, and these were shipped and stored in the different cities of Judah that were going to revolt. And in our site, we discovered very many jars of this type. And so we can tell without hesitation that obviously they participated in the revolt. And why is it called the LMLK type jar? Because on the handles of this jar, there is a stamp that you can see here. It's not so clear, but this particular one has a scarab with 4 wings. And it says here in ancient Hebrew, it says Lamelech, which means belonging to the king. And right here, we cannot see it because the stamp is not so clear. But usually there is a name of one of 4 cities that probably were store cities, and where these commodities were collected and from where they were shipped. So in our case, we have 2 stamped jar handles from the same jar, and it says that it came from Hebron. So Hebron is very well known as one of the cities where Hezekiah accumulated materials for the siege. We know that the place was destroyed by a military campaign because we find numerous sling stones. And here you can see just a couple of example of sling stones, and I know that Vernon knows these sling stones. We also find a lot of arrowheads and other types of projectiles. So again, we know that the destruction that we excavate was caused by a military action, and the material that we find corresponds to LACHISH stratum 3, so we can date it very nicely to Sennacherib's campaign. Besides, carbon-14 also helps. Now, one of the things that you have to understand is that the destruction, being as part of a military campaign, was sudden. And so basically, we get here the kind of situation as you get in Pompeii, where things are destroyed suddenly and everything is kept in place. So one of the things that we uncover are the houses of the residents of Tell Halif, and we refer to these houses as the 4-room or pillared houses, and in a minute I will explain why. Here you can see a row of houses along the city wall. The city wall would go right here, and here are the houses that were built against the city wall. One of the houses that we excavated in phase 3 still had the pillars standing right here, and that's one reason why it's called a pillar house. And I'll show you what these houses looked like. They are also known as 4-room houses because basically they had 4 large rooms. This was the back room, one. There was here a second room that usually was divided, as you can see, a third room, and then the middle room. You can see here another house also with a back room, 1, 2, 3, 4, with the pillars still standing. Because the people of this particular period were getting ready for the siege, as you can see here in this reconstruction, they had many stored jars, and all of them are of the type that I described before, the LMLK-type store jar. This is one of the houses we just recovered in our phase 4. The house was built against the city wall, which unfortunately eroded. It was right here at the edge of the mound, but the house was built against it. This house did not have 4 rooms, it had only 3 rooms, but we know of many 3-room houses that basically follow the same idea. It has pillars right here, there is 1 pillar here, there is 1 pillar here, and so you have the back room here and 2 long rooms with, by the way, a food preparation area that is right here, and we'll take another look at this in detail a little later. There is another house right next door here, another pillared house. Here is 1 pillar, another pillar, a pillar base right here, and this house was also built against the city wall. That's an aerial view of this particular neighborhood, and you can see the different houses that were built against the city wall that was running here along the edge of the mound. A closer view of one of these houses, you can see that some of the floors were cobbled floors, and right here another house with a food preparation area. I will talk about it in a minute, and a textile workshop, which also I will discuss in a minute. This particular area, this cobbled area, was probably a stall for animals. One of the things that Halif is known for, because of our excavation, is the fact that it was a center for textile production. And how do we know that? In almost every place that we excavate, every house that we uncovered, we find these clay loom weights. Right here, you can see them lying on the floor, but in most cases, we found them in large hoards, which means that in these particular houses at the time of destruction, no textile production work was done. Here in another house in field 4, we find a large concentration of loom weights. Again, you can tell that obviously no textile production was going on. However, when we came to field 5, which is the field that we recently have been working on, we discovered a workshop that probably was in operation when the city was destroyed. And the reason is that we find a lot of the loom weights in rows, which means that the loom was standing when the building was destroyed. This particular workshop was recovered in 3 stages, 3 different field seasons. We first started with this area, then we worked on this area, and finally we removed this area that is known as, this is the divider between the 2 squares. This area was taken down, and we finished uncovering the workshop. So here it is after everything was cleared out, but here is what it looked like when we were still working. As you can see, this is the area in between the 2 squares. It's known as the balk. And once we removed the balk, you could see all the stuff that was hidden underneath. And here you can see a bunch of balls, loom weights, and so forth. Now we had to recover it very carefully so we can reconstruct the material, and the reconstruction is very important. How did we do it? We divided the area into small squares of 50 by 50 centimeters, and each one of these squares was recovered separately into a separate bucket. As you can see right here is a bucket into which pottery and other finds would be placed. Each bucket is numbered and labeled. You can see here the tag. And so this was very important, because after doing it this way, we could reconstruct the position of every one of the vessels, every one of the objects in the room itself. That's what loom weights look on the floor of the house. You can see here. But the recovery of these loom weights had to be done very carefully. These are clay loom weights that were sun-dried, namely that they are easily deteriorating, and they had to be removed very, very carefully. Some of them got baked in the big conflagration that destroyed the buildings, but they had to be removed very carefully. And how did we do it? We labeled and numbered every one of them and plotted them on a plan. So we know exactly where they came from, and each one of them was removed separately so it can be measured and weighed, and their position in the room could help us determine what kind of textile material was produced there. Also, the weight can tell us what type of material they produced. A close-up of loom weights, and you can see there are different sizes. Most of them have this shape, we call it the donut shape, very original. And these are basically not loom weights, but spindle whorl. And this tells us that the people of Halif not only produce textile, but they also produce their own yarn. They spin their own yarn. Here are some tools that were made of bone and helped the weavers weave different kind of designs, and so they could produce fancy material. And we know from Assyrian documents that Judahite garments were very much valued. So it was very important to produce good quality material. Here's another close look at some of these loom weights. And for those who don't know what the loom looked like, this is a warp weighted loom, also known as an upright loom. And you can see here the weights, and they sort of weighted the warp. These are fancy spindle whorls that also we recovered. And I know that not everyone knows what a spindle looks like. So here is a picture from the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem of a spindle. So this is the spindle whorl. And since I guess in our case, the spindles were made of wood, they obviously rotted away, and only the whorl was left. And so you can see right here, these are the whorls. The whorls are made of different kinds of materials, could be a clay or a broken piece of pottery that was shaped into a spindle whorl, and this helped spinning the yarn and then providing the material for weaving. We find in almost every house a food preparation area, and let me show you one of them. This one was adjacent to the textile workshop, and you can see here the remains of a bread oven and a lot of ceramic vessels surrounding it. Right here is a grinding stone, and some other tools were found in this area. By the way, this wall that you see here is from the Roman period, so it had to be removed to get a complete picture of this room. Another food preparation area yielded this beautiful grinding installation. You can see here the lower grinding stone nestled in a very nice installation. And around this area, we found again many ceramic vessels. There was here a cobbled floor, which means that all sorts of activities that are related to food preparation took place here. And what kind of things we found around this grinding installation are these upper grinding stones. We find quite a few of them made mostly of basalt, but sometimes of other type of stones. Here's another upper grinding stone. Many of them were found in the food preparation areas. We also find some information related to religion and the cult. At one point in our phase 3, in this particular room, you saw already this picture, But in this particular room, we find a house shrine. That is what it looked like. This room, this shrine room, was recovered in this house, and it contained several objects like these standing stones, this incense burning stand, and in front of it this figurine head. And the figurine head belonged to a type of figurine that you see here. This photo is taken from a exhibition in a museum, but this is the type of figurines that in that period in Judah were found in almost every house. They are known as pillar figurines because the body looks like a pillar. The head was made in a mold. It has a particular hairstyle that is associated with the goddess Ashtoreth, but there is a big argument whether this is a depiction of the goddess Ashtoreth or Astarte or something else. So we are not going to get into this discussion right here, but it's important to realize that this particular room was dedicated to the worship of whoever this head belonged to. Now, it's important to remember that one of the things that Hezekiah did before his rebellion, he centralized the cult in Jerusalem. Until the time of Hezekiah, until the time of the revolt, people could worship at different places. Jerusalem was not the one and only central place. There are remains of a temple at a site not far from Beersheba known as Arad. The temple was buried during the time of Hezekiah, and this is obviously evidence to the religious reforms that he initiated. Another temple was found in Lachish that was also gone out of commission in the time of Hezekiah. But the interesting thing is that here at Halif, the shrine room was in operation at the time of the revolt, which means that even though Hezekiah centralized religion in Jerusalem, certain cultic activities were continued in the outlying towns and villages, maybe not offering sacrifices of animals. This had to be done in Jerusalem, but here on these standing stones and in this incense stand, incense was offered probably during the last minutes of this the life of this town. We found this particular body of a pillar figurine that just shows that almost every house had something like this. Plus, we found an incense, or more than one, but this is the fanciest incense altar that we recovered. It came from the textile workshop. It is nicely decorated, and you can see here the decorations on every side of the altar. As you could see, the altar was used, and there is some soot here. Unfortunately, we could not analyze. I mean, we tried, but we could not find out what kind of material was burned. Interestingly, overlying the remains from the Iron II, we find in the soil that covers these remains all of these figurines or actually fragments of figurines, and they date to the Persian Hellenistic period. So it seems that Halif was a cult center in the Persian Hellenistic period. We did not find the cult center itself, but it seems that it must have been in close proximity to field 4 and field 5, where we find these fragments, probably part of the service was offering the figurine and breaking it and then throwing it into a storage pit that is known as a favisa. And sometime, probably in the Roman Byzantine period, where people were busily cultivating the top of the mound, they bumped into this favisa, they emptied it, they took the material out and spread it all over the remains of the iron two, making it leveled and possible to cultivate. And you can see we have hundreds and hundreds of these, and they are still being studied and analyzed. So we finished our excavation in 2016. 2016 was our last field season. Since then, whenever we could go back in the summer, we are working on analyzing and preparing the finds for publication. The biggest thing, as you can imagine, and it's probably the hardest, is pottery restoration. So we are working on this, and each piece has to be drawn, and pottery drawing is an art of its own. It has a certain standards. I'll show you in a minute an example. And so it takes quite a bit of time. Another thing that has to be done is animal bone analysis. We collected every bone we could because we sifted a lot of the material. And specialists known as zoo archaeologists analyze the bones and can tell us, number one, what domesticated animals were raised at the site and what they can find concerning wild animals, because some of the diet was substituted by wild animals like gazelle or birds. And also this tells us, especially wild animals, it tells us a little bit about the ecology of the time, the same as with organic samples that help us analyze what kind of plants were cultivated, and at the same time also what weeds were present when the site was destroyed. We have all the land and marine shells analyzed, and this helps us with detecting trade relationships that our site had with other parts of the region. In spite of the fact that it is called the Iron Age, people still were using stone tools, so we find lithics that have to be analyzed. And when we were studying that particular altar, we did a petrographical analysis of the raw material and found out that basically the incense altars that we found at Halif were locally made, which is very interesting. Besides, when we study the figurines, we try to find out the source of the clay. because this could tell us whether these figurines were imported, whether people came to Halif to worship, or that the figurines were made at Halif and people could maybe purchase them when they come to worship at Halif. Interestingly, as we have the specialists study the figurines, they discovered that, as you could see, most of these figurines, or all of them, were made in a mold. So when the clay was packed into the mold, the artist left fingerprints on the back of the figurines. So now our specialists are also studying not just the figurines themselves, but the fingerprints. And can we tell whether the same artists with the fingerprints that they left, whether the same artists created these figurines? Also, I was told that it is possible to tell the age and sex of the person who left the fingerprints. So, so this is something that is still being studied. The textile production is a big thing to study because, as you could see, we have hundreds and hundreds of loom weights and quite a few tools that go with it. And so all of this has to be studied, and hopefully we will be able to tell what kind of textiles were produced at Tell Halif. And in addition, we sometimes also are engaged in experimental archaeology to see if what we think about what was going on in the Iron Age is really what we think. As I said, restoring pottery is what we are engaged in right now, if we can get back to Israel. Unfortunately, with COVID, we couldn't go back last summer. We hope to be able to go back this summer and continue with the work. But as you can see, each one of these buckets, the 50 by 50 centimeters areas, each one of them is laid on one of these trays. Each piece is numbered, and then we try to match these pieces. Hopefully we manage to get as much as possible of this vessel. And here is an example of some of the vessels that were reconstructed. It's important to put them all together. This assemblage tells us that this is what the inhabitants of Halif in the 8th century were using. And when we compare it with LACHISH 3, it tells us that, yes, we are in the 8th century. We are at the end of the 8th century, and we are dealing with a destruction that Sennacherib caused. He didn't leave a calling card, but the analysis of the material shows us that that's when it happened. Now you can see here, this is an example of some of the vessels that were reconstructed, and this gives you an idea what a drawing of archaeological finds it looks like. Here is one of the finds, which is a seal that was found in that house that I showed you before. I was told by an expert that this seal probably came from northern Israel. And this is an important fact, because the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. And a lot of the people went to exile. However, probably many of them became refugees in Judah, Jerusalem grew to a tremendous extent. Many of the Israelites from the north came to Jerusalem, but probably many of them also went to the other cities and towns like Halif. And one family that was right here in this house left behind this seal. And as I said, this particular expert tells me that this is a type of seal that was very common in the north. We were talking about zooarchaeology and identification of bones, and that's what animal bones that we extract from the dirt look like, and we can tell what type of animals were raised or hunted by the occupants of the site. Now, I can tell you, it's not a secret that the most common animal for diet and other things was the sheep and goats. It's very hard to tell the difference between a sheep and a goat by the bones. I'm told there is only one bone that is different. If you don't get this bone, you cannot tell if it's a sheep or a goat. So you will see in many cases the reference to this animal is sheep goat, and sheep goat is what we have mostly. And also another thing that can be studied is how the animals were butchered. Were they butchered by professionals, or was it done by someone else? What parts of the animal were eaten? What was the age of the animal? Can tell us about about the economy. If the animal was young, it means that it was raised for meat. If the animal was old, it means it was raised for the byproducts, maybe the milk, the wool or hair. So it's very important. These type of bones, the astragale, were used as game pieces, or today we use dice. And in those days, they used these particular knuckle bones in their games. I mentioned the fact that we have seashells and land shells analyzed. These particular ones, the cowrie shells, came from the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean. So it tells us, obviously, that Tell Halif had some kind of trade relations with these regions. We can find also what kind of climate was at the time by studying the land snails. So a lot can come out of these analyses. Here are our experts studying the figurines and documenting the fingerprints. I talked about some experimental archaeology. One of the things that we did, when people always talk about these installations and calling them bread ovens. So how did they use these bread ovens? So here we built a bread oven, the same way that, the same type that we find in these houses. We prepared a dough based on a recipe, local recipe, and then went through the whole process of making bread. And you can see here how the oven was fired, the dough was stuck to the walls of the oven, and then when it was ready, was picked out and eaten. One of the things that I want to share with you is one of the difficulties that we have in archaeology, and this involves overhead or aerial photography. Archaeologists want to get the big picture. This big picture was taken at Gezer in 1973 when I was working there. Here is the city gate, the city wall. Right here is the sloping ramp that is known as a glacis, storehouses, and so forth. And here is the entrance to a water system. To get a picture like this, an excavation that has money would have a nice photo tower like this. And the photograph is taken early in the morning before sunrise. So the shadows cannot disrupt and cover some of the features. But not every excavation has the money to afford something like this. And especially when we have, we need to take photographs on a slope. We cannot use a ladder or a photo tower. So what do we do? In the case of this taking pictures on a slope, we needed some ingenuity. So we borrowed this tractor from the kibbutz, and we used it for taking that picture that you just saw. But on level land, we needed a photo tower. Again, our relationship with the kibbutz was very, very good. So we borrowed this stand that was used in the farm. They raised turkeys, and this would hold on top of it a water tank for the turkeys. So we used it, we took it, we built a tower, and we used this tower to take overhead pictures, except that moving this tower is a little bit problematic, but we managed. Sometimes we were lucky, again, because of our good relationship with the kibbutz, we would get an airplane to take some aerial photos. This particular photo was taken from a light plane. The kibbutz used dust croppers, and the company that did the spraying would give them every year 2 free flights. So they would give us one of the flights. And so in the summer when we were there and we were ready to take these overhead pictures, we would fly over and take these pictures. So, but we relied on the goodwill of the kibbutz and the availability of the crop dusters. Then 2 enterprising Israelis decided to start a business of taking archaeological aerial pictures with a blimp. And for a couple of years, they had the monopoly of taking pictures of, I guess, every excavation in Israel. Right here is the camera, and they would control the blimp with 2 ropes. Unfortunately, having the ropes sometimes places them in the photo, so this is problematic. But some of the photos that you saw came from the blimp, and so this was, quite an innovation. But it was also expensive. We had to pay about $1,000 to bring the blimp and take photographs at the end of one of the seasons. So then the drone was invented and became very common. You can see my colleague, Dr. Sung Ho Bang, operating the drone. And what we did, we used the drone on a daily basis. Every day we would fly the drone and take pictures and see the progress of the dig. Here's a view from the drone of the area that we were excavating in our last field season, and I'll treat you to an overflight, which will give you an idea of what it looks like, what the tell looks like. You can see here, this is an area, this is field 4, right here is field 3, field 2 is somewhere here. And this it shows you the area around the tell. Gives you an idea of what the terrain is. We are looking east, the sun is coming up. Here we see the kibbutz. The cemetery is here. Looking west. Down the road, this is the modern road, but it's on the same place where the ancient road used to go. I guess we'll have to get the drone landing. Actually, it took us two seasons to learn how to do it. The first season, unfortunately, because of the wind, we did not think of how to launch it and land it, and it broke. So in the second season, after fixing it, we managed to operate it better. The idea is that you need two people, one to hold it when you launch it and when you land it, and the other one to operate it. Now, this is a picture of from the drone, but the reason that I want to show it to you is that this is something that still needs to be studied. This is the bedrock and the way it crops up at the top of the mound. And what it has, and we can see here in the picture, is a water system that is made of cisterns, and they are all laid in a row. Right here, this is a fig tree that grows out of one of the cisterns. Here is another one, another one, another one. And this particular one we discovered with a ground penetrating radar, and it gives us an inkling of what the system looks like. This is the inside of this cistern that we discovered with the radar. And this is looking from the bottom of the entry shaft, and this is looking towards the entry shaft. And of course, we cannot finish without thanking the staff and the students who helped us, who came with us every summer and really did the hard work. We are standing on a pile of dirt that we removed in the last 2 seasons, and these people really built this mound. Thank you.
Don Stein.
You have to
I want to volunteer to go, but I do have a question about language interpretation. If it and it may be very naive because I'm not in this field, but if you have a dead language, and you're giving those translations of what the different kings said, how do you really judge the accuracy or validity of the translation? How do you know it's real, or not just filling in gaps that you think it should sound right? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, there are experts, linguists, people who specialize in these dead languages. Nowadays, we have so many documents. This particular, the documents that I was quoting were written in cuneiform, which is a writing system that was that used a stylus and that was puncturing clay, either tablets or this prism that was made of clay. And the different, the stylus was used in different combinations. And this particular writing system was syllabic. So for every possible syllable, there was a sign, and so you have a consonant.
Interesting.
Pardon? And you know how to pronounce it, and then you compare it to other Semitic languages, and basically most Semitic languages are very, very similar. Words have the same roots. So in this case, because it's a syllabary writing system, it's easier to be able to pronounce. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, it's harder because mostly the signs are consonants. So
Oded,
yeah.
This is Vernon. Maybe you ought to tell him about the many cuneiform tablets that are really recording contents of grain and all kinds of things.
Not only that, but there are multilingual tablets, and the multilingual, since they are written in different, sometimes 2 or 3 languages, they help us, to decipher. The same way as the Rosetta Stone helped decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. There is an inscription known as the Behistun inscription that helped us decipher cuneiform. So that's how it's possible. Now, I would say that it takes quite a few years to learn this. It's not as easy as learning, say, French or Arabic, as much as these languages are hard to learn. But just to read these languages, since you need a different sign for every syllable, it's very hard.
Ursula or David?
Ed, thank you very much. Very nice. Tell me, do we have any inscriptions? And do we have any inscriptions? And do we know the name of this city at the time that you were excavating?
Okay, good question. We assume that the name of the city was Rimon. The name is mentioned several times in the Bible. We did not find it on the site itself, but there is a very, about 1 kilometer south of our site, there is a site that is a little bit later from the Roman Byzantine period, and it's known in Arabic as Ramamim, which means the mother of the pomegranates. And Rimon in Hebrew means pomegranate. Now, there was one of the early church fathers, Eusebius, wrote a book that is known as the Onomasticon. in which he lists all the towns and villages in his time, which is in the 3rd, 4th century of the Common Era. He lists these towns and tries to identify them with biblical towns. And when he comes to our region, he mentions a village by the name of Rimon. So the assumption is that our Tell was Rimon. Now, as far as written material, we did not find any inscriptions, but we found fragments of bulla, which are sealings that were placed on documents. So if you find bullas or even fragments of bullas, you can assume that the people there, or some of them, could read. But we didn't find inscriptions per se.
Thank you.
Lynn Gannam.
Hi, Oded.
Hi.
I'm curious, when your groups were not on site working at this particular site, were other people working there? And if not, how did you protect the site and the artifacts that you had found?
Okay, so first of all, we were the only ones who were working on the site. I guess the Antiquities Authority would like that the same people would work rather than have different groups work. So in a way, we have the monopoly on the site. The unfortunate thing is that when we are not there, the site is open, and in spite of the fact that we erect a fence at the end of the field season, people come. This forest that you saw around the site is a picnic area, and a lot of people come for picnics. And Bedouin shepherds like to come and graze the herds, and for some reason they feel that they have to enter the excavated area. But on the whole, people don't visit the site, and the only destruction is the only destruction that we find is really the elements, rain. By the way, David, when I said that the site is known as Rimon, we found in one of the tombs in the Iron Tooth Cemetery, we found a very nice bowl, and in its center there is a pomegranate. It is on display at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and you could say that, okay, this was the seal of the city, and it was placed in one of the tombs.
Gretchen.
Just a fascinating revelation of what daily life was like until destruction came. What I'm wondering is whether in that period, say 701, daily life for people in comparably small villages in Assyria or Egypt or elsewhere in the world at that time would have been pretty similar to what was happening in your site?
Well, it depends on the resources that they have. It depends on the climate, the environment, and so on. So when we study daily life at our site, we have to remember that that's what it was in this particular region. I mean, it was pretty similar, I would say, a little further to the north, but I maybe the techniques, if they were weaving, making textile, the techniques were the same. but the question is, were conditions enabling them to raise the animals that were needed? If they were into weaving, did they import, the wool? Did they import the yarn?
I was wondering about wood, Oded, whether, I mean, you mentioned that the forest in the area now has been
Right.
recently planted, but back in the day, was it relatively unwooded?
It was a kind of a very low forest, what is known as a maquis, very low type of shrubs. And some of the trees that were grown there were olive trees.
Oh, yeah.
But they were, for domestic purposes. But I guess the wild trees were different. I mean, the trees that you see there today are mostly pine trees, eucalyptus trees, cypress, and so forth. But
yeah, I was thinking of the cedars and Gilgamesh, that
right.
kind of thing.
Yeah, but exactly, other trees had to be imported, and the relationship between Egypt and the Phoenicians, the people in what is now Lebanon, is tied very closely to the cedars. They needed cedar trees for certain things, and the Assyrians also, in Mesopotamia, they didn't have trees, so they had to bring them down from the mountains. So obviously, this means that you have to have people who specialize in this kind of thing.
Thank you. Fascinating.
Selden.
Someone asked earlier a question about how do you know what these scripts actually mean? So this is a plug for a absolutely fascinating book, if the camera will pick it up.
Or something is, no?
No, the background isn't helping.
No.
At any rate, the book is called The Riddle of the Labyrinth, and it's about the decipherment of Linear B, which was a script found on tablets on the island of Crete.
Right.
And we had a woman in the 1930s who basically cracked this. Her name was, forget her name. Anyway, she was at, I think, City University of New York. So she was dealing with an unknown writing system for an unknown language from about 1400 DC without computers. And she cracked it as an early form of Greek. But she died before somebody else claimed the solution.
And actually, you mentioned Linear B. So Linear B was deciphered, but there is another system called Linear A, and Linear A, as far as I know, hasn't been deciphered.
No, there aren't enough tablets in Linear A. At least with Linear B, they had thousands of tablets and they could establish a data set, but Linear A just isn't enough, so it's still a mystery.
Julia.
I'm in Michigan. I met Oded at the Kibbutz Lahav in 1963. So I am a very old friend and also a big fan of Oded, of course. And I wanted to ask, what was the population of Tell Halif, more or less, in your period?
Well, there are different ways of computing populations. And I don't want to get into it, but I would say that probably this site could support about 500 people.
Okay, so it was a fairly small
Yes.
village. I mean, we're not talking about a city or even a town.
No, it's not a town. It's just a town. It was fortified. It had a fortification system that included a wall, a sloping rampart that we call a glacis, and we didn't find the gate, although I think I know where it's supposed to be. But it was well fortified. However, Sennacherib managed to breach it.
Right, but they built already on a rise of land, correct?
That's right. At that time, they were already on top
Already
of a major hill that was built up for about 2,000 years.
Yeah, okay, thank you. It's great. I love hearing more about it.
Thank you.
always.
Vernon.
Yes, Oded, thank you
Yes.
so much for this absolutely terrific presentation. Just really filled with everything, really wonderful. I wanted to ask just a more personal question. When you lived on the kibbutz there nearby, did you used to wander onto this site at times and look at the things on it or picnic at it at all?
Yes, after every rain, I would go up.
Looking for
Or-
things, looking for items?
Yeah, because I don't know if you noticed, but the top of the Tell has military trenches,
Yeah.
and so after every rain, some of it would collapse, and so I would go there with a friend or two, and we would look for things.
So did you already have a collection of some things
Yes,
from the site?
yes. Not only that, but because I worked in the fields, I was mostly involved in the field crop operation, and we had about 4,000 acres of land that stretched along the border with what is now in the West Bank. There are many sites. So every so often I would get off the tractor and go and explore.
Thanks. Great.
Okay, Don Stein.
I was wondering, this is my last question. I was under the impression as you were speaking that these people were Hebrews, and yet you were showing little idols, and I thought we didn't worship idols. So what is the story?
The story is that they told you the wrong story.
Okay,
I mean, the thing is, all you have to do is read the Bible, and what do the prophets preach about? I mean, they constantly talk about the people doing the wrong stuff. Now, the prophets call it the wrong stuff, but for the people, this is what they were doing. This was their daily stuff. So, there was this prophetic school that believed only in Yahweh, and there were the people who believed in what they believed and worshipped in what they worshipped.
My goodness.
So you have these figurines, and without getting too deeply into this thing, but we know also from inscriptions that were found at archaeological sites that people were worshiping at the same time Yahweh and Asherah. And I showed you those pillar figurines that I think they are of Asherah, but a lot of scholars don't think so. So, as I said, there is disagreement, but I think that these are figurines of Asherah. And so if there is an inscription that tells you, blessed be you to Yahweh and his Asherah, it just shows that that's what the people believed.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's really a revelation to me. Thank you.
Not only that, actually, we are told by the Bible that there was an Asherah statue in the temple. So,
wow, amazing.
no, not everyone. Everyone believed the same thing, and there was a freedom of religion.
Hey, thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh my goodness.
One question I have is what do you think houses looked like above what is left there, and what was the function of the pillars?
Okay, the thing is, that's a good question, because the pillars are quite massive. And actually, we know from what we find that there was more than one story. And these pillars were major pillars. So there must have been at least one more story. And there was a lot of living being done on the roof. The roofs were flat. And we know also from references in the Bible that there were upper stories. There are several incidents in the Bibles mentioning Elijah and Elisha and how in their relationship with certain people, when they came to visit them, they were hosted in the upper story, the upper room. So there were upper rooms. The big question is, when we look at the 4-room house, was the central room, the central long room, was it open or was it covered? Was it an open courtyard or was it covered? I'm of the opinion that it was covered, and only on the second story it was open. But there are those who suggest that it was open all the way. I think it was very impractical to have a house that it has an open atrium all the way, just life would have been miserable in the winter.
What would the rest of the walls have been? Would they have been stone?
Mud brick. You have the stone foundation, the stone socle, and then on top of it you have mud brick, and the walls were plastered, and the roof was made usually out of branches and some other kind of things, and then it was plastered all over, and it had to be redone probably every year in preparation for the rainy season. And when we excavate these houses, many times we get remnants of the second story or the roof, and if we do it very carefully, we can separate between the material that is on the ground floor and the material that comes from the second floor.
What would the ceiling of the first floor and the floor of the second story, what would that have been? Would that have been wood branches and so forth?
Yes, and dirt, beaten dirt, plaster. Now, I cannot tell you if it was whitewashed.
Right. Okay, Gretchen.
I know we need to wrap up and allow you to go, if you will, or continue to chat with us. But I too have one more question. I'm just wondering, in your wonderful life of excavation work and analysis work, can you name, has there been like one incredibly memorable moment when you were hunched over a hole in the ground and looked at something and said, "Oh my God"?
Yes.
Lots of such moments, I would think.
There were several moments, but since I showed you that water cistern that we discovered with a ground penetrating radar, once we removed the dirt at that particular spot, and we found a pile of stone that was blocking the entrance to the cistern, and this pile was placed there on purpose. So we dismantled the pile of stone, and we were looking into a shaft that was, going down, and being in charge of the operation, I got a ladder and put it down and went down the shaft.
Wow.
Into it was an Indiana Jones moment, because first of all, the place was sealed since probably 400 or 500 to the Common Era, and so I was sort of the first, like Columbus. I was there, breathing the air that was
wonderful,
there.
wonderful.
And I didn't know what to expect. I'm going down into this very dark hole, and who knows what they're in. Yeah. So this was quite a moment.
Indiana Jones, and indeed, you need a fedora, Oded.
I used to have one.
Thank you.